So if this is your first time that you've, or you're not very familiar with AI, what I've done is, because tonight's topic is around generative AI, I thought I should find a definition and put it out to us so that we can also think about it and use it as a to think about while we listen to this our three speakers. And so what I've done is I've just simply gone to Wikipedia and got their definition for generative AI as a starting point. And Wikipedia says that generative AI is where artificial intelligence is used to generate text, images, and other media. This is new media, but it is based on the characteristics of the data that the AI has been trained in. So that's what Wikipedia says. So that's perhaps our starting point for understanding. And for example, a few weeks back, I prepared and preached a sermon on a passage from Matthew's Gospel. And after I preached that sermon, as an experiment, I asked the popular generative AI program, ChatGPT, which has been very much in the news, to produce an 800-word sermon on the same passage. Which it did in the same time it took me to write my opening sentence. So there you go. So I was going to ask or call upon Kevin as our first speaker. And the question I'd like to put to you, Kevin, is this: journeying in learning and journeying in faith development both involve creativity. How does a journey in learning compare with a journey through faith? And where might AI in particular generative AI sit in or with these journeys?
Thank you. I hope that my screen is being shared at the moment.
Yes,
I just need to make sure that we can actually see what I'm doing. Okay. Yeah, let me just hang on a second. I'm going to stop doing that for a second because there's something else I want to do for a minute. Yeah, there we are. Okay. I think, as I mentioned in my little sort of introduction a minute ago, I've been very fortunate. My line of work, and by good fortune, a main interest of mine, has always been education, and I've both taught and researched science education in particular throughout my working life. I'm basically an astronomer, so astronomy and physics have been the subjects of interest. And today I find myself both teaching astronomy and physics to school children, but also to other groups of people, from very young people, primary school people, but also outside schools, Cubs and Scouts and so forth, right the way through to more senior people in groups like Open Age, for example. And educationally, across the entire age range, and indeed not just in the UK, but in China as well, particularly where I've got various links with the university and various schools, and a couple of other countries as well. I've become particularly fascinated with two things, which both impact upon, I think, what we're going to be talking about tonight. The first is the growing interdisciplinarity of education, of teaching and learning, reflecting, I think, how the interdisciplinary nature of life itself in the modern world is developing. I'll return to this area shortly. The other thing, the second thing, is basically to do with misconceptions in astronomy. For a long time, I've been keen to find out a lot more about the sorts of things in astronomy that children misunderstand, and especially these days, why these misconceptions persist, despite the jaw-dropping advances in educational techniques and technology. For example, in Britain? Why is it warmer in July than it is in January? And how do we explain the different?
So I already want to click off. I already want to get this shit off the screen.
These are fairly standard questions, which we must not be ashamed to say continue to puzzle us well beyond our childhoods, I think. Of course, alongside these interests goes my Christian faith, perhaps less alongside and more sort of intertwined, threading itself through my life. I certainly like to think that both learning and teaching, as Jeremy has mentioned already, both learning and teaching and my journey through faith have a lot of parallels, a lot of things in common as journeys of discovery, during which experiences and revelations, things which are inspiring us, clarifying things, and indeed motivating us to continue our journey. Now, my faith and how I live it and seek to develop it is as I say, an ongoing journey, as indeed I think is the journey of both learning but also teaching. Now, Jeremy, you mentioned that in both of these journeys, you suggest that creativity will be involved, and obviously we're looking at generative AI tonight.
Yeah, no one cares.
The first thing to say is that yes, I do think it plays a role, and in fact, more than one role, and I regard it in a very positive way. I think a couple of years ago, Jeremy will back me up on this because he was involved in these podcasts that Graham mentioned, but we also had discussions with people from various churches, and there's no doubt about it that amidst this explosion, there was a lot of fear, a lot of concern, a lot of anxiety about AI. And I think that, you know, how the genie was now out of the bottle, how it was going to affect our religious life and our practices was of great concern amongst people. I think it's certainly the case that the more thought there is about AI and how it's going to affect our lives,
no one cares, you big ass forehead.
the more thought there is about humanity itself. And I think, and indeed the various dimensions of what makes us human, including spirituality and empathy and various other characteristics. What does it mean to be human? I think in looking to see what AI is and how it affects our lives, we are effectively turning a mirror upon ourselves and considering these questions. You know, if we were created in God's own image, then what exactly is that image?
James,
I want to, though, just consider this idea of creativity, because I think that people are happy with the distinction between being creative and simply producing something which is new. I think many current thinkers in this area, and I'm going to mention Margaret Bowden. I'm just going to share my screen at this point rather than as I tried to do earlier on. I think someone like Margaret Bowden is a name I hope we all recognize, and I hope we all know about her. She's somebody who's been around for a long time. She has some amazing ideas, but she has particularly powerful ideas and particularly good ideas about creativity in the realms of AI. So, just in case you've never seen a picture of Margaret, here she is. There, okay. Margaret Bowden's here, and the main thing that she's done, I think, is to basically say there are different types of creativity, because when we talk about AI and creativity, we need to know a bit about what creativity is. So as I say, there is a big distinction between just generating something which is new and indeed something which is definitely to be regarded as creative. Now, as an educator and as a researcher, I'm drawn to this creative interest and this creative element in teaching and learning, how it might be spotted, how it might be developed in people, and I suppose this is the hardest bit, how it might be assessed. You know, how do how do you examine creativity in a formal assessment? Discuss sort of thing. Perhaps we can all, from time to time, identify with a eureka moment, what we might call a eureka moment, a point at which we can say that something has lit up in our minds, something has revealed itself, and we may have been creative, or something has been created for us. Interestingly, I don't know if any of you ever listened to the Life Scientific on Radio 4 in the UK and indeed around the world. But recently a man called Sir Michael Berry was interviewed, and he was asked about the eureka moment. And he said, well, he doesn't really believe in it. He believes it's not really a moment. And in any case, no sooner does that moment seem to come than that it seems to pass as well. He invented, by the way, this sort of humorous hypothetical particle called a clariton. And the idea is that, when you're sitting there and thinking about things, you get struck by a clariton, and it clarifies things. He said that unfortunately, but just like all matter, there's antimatter, there are anticlaritons, and no sooner have you been struck with a clariton that you get struck with an anticlariton, and the light bulb seems to go off, or you start to get a bit more murky about your understanding. But I'm not suggesting the claritons exist, don't worry, and Michael Berry certainly isn't. But it is interesting to think, what physiologically is going on when people experience that moment of revelation or indeed creativity. It happens with children all the time, of course. And even though they may not have made a great fresh discovery themselves, the revelatory experience has definitely come upon them. And I think at this point it's worth borrowing some concepts from philosophers and psychologists to do with two different types, if you like, of creativity. There's psychological creativity and there's historical creativity. And in the case of the former, children who are discovering things for themselves, it's new to them, it's creative to them, that is a genuine moment of creativity. And that's the sort of thing which I think we all have, and some people obviously have it in a way that nobody's ever thought of it before, and it can be genuinely thought to be a useful idea. And I think that's the other thing actually about what it means to be creative, and whether creativity has led to something important here. It's often said that something creative, something which has been created, if it's got to be new, it's got to be surprising, and it's got to be valuable. Okay, and I think the question is, how do we as human beings assess those things? As I say, you can do it in the classroom, you can do it with young people very easily in a kind of academic context. But how about in life itself? How about in our spiritual journeys? I think this is I don't know how much longer Jeremy wants me to rattle on for, but do give me a minute's warning or something, Jeremy, if you like. But I think with generative AI, we obviously now have the possibility of producing new ideas, new concepts in abundance, and modern computers actually find it easy to produce novel combinations of things that we've never seen before. And we mustn't forget that Margaret Bowden mentioned that there are basically three types of creativity. There's the exploratory, there's the combinatory creativity, and then there's the perhaps the most difficult one to define, which is the transformative creativity. So computers can actually do combinations of things really easily and very, very quickly. But interestingly, at the moment, these AI, chatbots, ChatGPT, Bing Chat, and so forth, they come across as being very clever. They can answer questions, but what they really are doing is saying, okay, what should be the next word in this sentence? And they're accessing, colossal amounts of data. Now, in both of these cases I've mentioned, or that's been alluded to in the question, journeys through faith, journeys through learning, through teaching and learning. There's one final thing I just want to mention, which is to do with truth. we often wonder about what truth is, and indeed whether there's an absolute truth, whether truth is relative, and so forth. I think that there's a great danger, of course, in education, that truth is something which is taken as read when things like AI generate something. It's a big problem, and of course, as information gets extracted, if you like, or generated by AI, that information can then effectively be fed back into the system. So, in a sense, is AI going to be something which, for us as human beings, reflects the truth, or is it indeed something which is going to be generating truth? So, I think if the source of information, if you like, is riddled with inconsistencies, falsehoods, what does this mean for the veracity of what's been produced, and which might inform, educate, and inspire us? So while AI can provide valuable support in certain aspects related to religious beliefs, it is crucial to appreciate this intersection with sensitivity. Many aspects of religious belief involve deeply personal and emotional experiences that may not be fully captured or understood by AI. Now, those last two sentences, of course, were generated by ChatGPT when I fed in the question earlier to see what it said. So we certainly have a lot to be grateful for, a lot to be positive about, a lot to be hopeful for. I think we need to tread with care, but tread we must. And I think that, I know I'm not sharing the actual presentation here, but hopefully you can see this picture here, which is Isaac Newton's famous quotation, which is that if I've seen further, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. Well, this might just redefine what we understand by giants these days, helping us to see further.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much. And just before I ask Lee and Calvyn if they would like to comment on what Kevin has taken us through, I just wanted to apologize for the earlier intrusions.
I think you're on mute, Jeremy.
I can hear you fine.
I just wanted to apologize for the earlier intrusions. And if Lee would you perhaps like to say something about that has struck you from what Kevin has taken us through?
Right. No, I was particularly struck by the final image and famous Newton quote. I think part of the promise here is that generative AI can amplify our creativity, be a great tool for creativity and expression and communication, much like that robot in that drawing. Can help that person that they want to be taller, see farther, and run faster.
Right, thank you very much. Calvyn, is there anything you'd like to say into what Kevin has spoken about?
Yeah, I think there's two interesting things that I picked up on. One is this kind of view about creativity as technicality, so the feedback loop. And I was wondering about, coming from faith traditions, we have another side of that called wisdom, which is not a technical skill, it's a situational skill. And I think that's worth just musing about. How can a machine be wise, for example? Can a machine be wisely creative? That's something, and as we all know from the Bible, in the Proverbs, what wisdom doesn't always mean doing the right thing. It means doing the contextual thing that is good for the situation. Now I think that's one thing I was wondering about. And the other thing that struck me was, again, on this feedback loop thing, as you were speaking, Kevin, was that, if we are feeding all of our bad data and good data into the AI machine, shouldn't that encourage us to be better humans in general, considering we're feeding a lot of this information into it? So that was just 2 comments I was thinking about.
Oh, thank you very much, both of you. And for Kevin, I've got lots of things I'd like to indulge myself by asking you, Kevin, but we must move on. And I'd now like to just ask Lee if I can ask you a question, and if you take us through what you would like to say on this topic of generative AI, and what is the promise you see of generative AI in terms of personhood, and how does our personhood in God intersect with AI from your point of view?
I'm going to divide those questions at the word and talk first about the promise of generative AI in our personhood, and then address the second part. The first thing I want to make sure that I'm clear about is that when I'm talking about persons and personhood here, I'm talking about natural. I'm talking about natural human persons. In particular, we're not talking about the personhood of AIs here. That's not something that anyone seriously contends, or anyone of seriousness contends the current generation of the technology is capable of, even though generative AI does a spectacularly good job of producing texts and images and music, and that are very like what humans would do. We're not talking about having solved the general AI problem or making sentient AI here. And then also, we're most definitely, and I'll come back to this at the end, we're most definitely not talking about corporate persons, which in America is a subject, at least America, is a subject of great confusion. That businesses are people. And we're definitely not talking about the interest of businesses tonight. So what do I see in it is the promise of generative AI for the personhood of natural human beings, natural persons. First of all, I see generative AI aiding in interpersonal communication, making it easier and faster for people to come up with ideas, outlines, suggestions, right? In other words, aiding in their creativity, as we heard in the previous talk. That also includes giving people who are lacking in the physical skill, or perhaps even the physical ability to express themselves in certain art forms, that now the generative AI can be an intermediary where the person can describe images, moving images, video clips, music, song, poetry, that they haven't the skill or the practice or the lifetime of work, the tens of thousands of hours that it takes to build skills in some of these areas. Now, by describing what they want and perhaps doing that iteratively, looking at the results and doing it and participating creatively, right? They can express themselves and communicate communicate with others in these ways that they don't have the skill or practice to do unaided. A second area beyond interpersonal communication, well, actually, everything I've said so far, much of what I said so far sounded like communication on some sort of factual level of facts and text. But if we peel down a level, there's also, and there has been work on this and experimentation on this, and it is the promise is there to be able to communicate at emotional levels. We know that, I think that's easier to see from the visual art and the the production of visual art and music, because that's primarily maybe what we communicate, but also through textual or read oral expressions as well, being able to communicate emotional support, empathy, and so on, to support people in emotional ways, not just ways dealing with data and facts. Some of the earliest AI experiments, in fact, in the 60s, were incredibly small attempts at this, but with the much greater expressive power of expression and pretty much any medium that humans can do, right, adds power and possibility to that. The third thing I want to mention, the third promise of general AI for enhancing personhood is the ability to do aided self-directed learning. Generative AIs are spectacular, not just spectacular at chat and this creativity, but also, as has been mentioned, they currently are already trained in all of the text or media corpuses that can be obtained by the people that build them. So that means there's lots of amongst the data they've been trained with is the key texts, analytical texts, critical texts about pretty much pedagogical texts on pretty much every field of human learning, limited only by what's available due to copyright and licensing issues. So we'd expect those things to open up even more over time. So for people who are, so all this means that properly used, generative AI can support people teaching themselves much more thoroughly than is easily possible today. Now, of course, that leaves aside issues of learning things that require practice, right? So that's where there's most definitely a role for human teachers and human guidance in what to practice and having that practice evaluated. So I'm not saying that generative AI is going to take over teaching. That's not the case. And also, it can't set standards, right? So, but that is nonetheless a very, very powerful tool and possibility. So let me turn to the second part of the question, and I'll remind everybody it was how does personhood in God intersect with artificial intelligence. So for me, that's about that question is about how do we respond to the gift of our personhood from God, and the presence of God's image in all of us. And the touchstone that I'm going to use to answer that is the Great Commandment. You shall love God with all your heart and soul and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. As in the ways that I've outlined above, each of the ways that I've outlined above, there's the promise of giving us enhanced ways to love God with our mind, by expressing that love through writing, through media and speaking, all the things that generative AI does, as being amplified, our desires to do that, our basic ideas to do that, being amplified with generative AI. It gives us this potential is there for enhancing our teaching one another, how to love God, and endeavoring in the project, the lifelong project that we share as Christians of seeking understanding of our faith. But the Great Commission also tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves. I've mentioned teaching. I've mentioned one way that we to love our neighbors, we have to communicate with them, and I've discussed how generative AI can improve our interpersonal communication, our expressions of empathy, all of which are part of understanding our neighbors, their needs, and being able to share with them so that we can express our love in the most helpful and appropriate ways, situationally. But also loving our neighbor involves preventing harm. My answers so far have all been in the positive promises. Unfortunately, every one of those positive promises is accompanied with a danger or a potential for misuse or abuse of generative AI, right? If we can communicate better with people, there's the temptation to misinform, the temptation to use our ability to communicate better to control them. That temptation, I would say, is most definitely there. The more powerful, or the ability to act on that temptation is the greater, the higher amount of power that we already have. Hence my reference earlier to, I'm not talking about benefiting corporate persons here. The bigger the business, the wealthier the persons, the more powerful the political institutions, the higher the ability to act on the temptations to misinform and attempt to control using generative AI. Similarly, the ability to express better empathy and sympathy and emotional connection, the other side of that coin, the temptation is to engage in emotional manipulation.
Right. Thank you. That's I really like that. There's two sides to the coin there, and as made in the image of God, one of the things we do live with is risk. Mm-hmm. And I really like this idea of that living out the Great Commandment can be enhanced through generative AI. I was just wondering, Kevin and Calvyn, if there's anything you two would like to briefly speak into into what Lee has been taking us through.
Yes, thanks, Lee. And sorry, I must apologize. There's something on my screen here called an AI companion. I don't know if you've all got it at the bottom of your screens here. I'm tempted to put it on, but I'm a bit frightened. But anyway, I'm obviously interested in the direction of travel in terms of developing what you might call higher level characteristics in AI. So Lee, you mentioned those yourself, to do with empathy and sympathy and so forth. I've got my own concerns about relationships, if you like. So, I mean, when we talk about love, for example, I mean, do you think that there will ever come a time when AI can be said to love or care?
Not with the technology currently, certainly not with the technology currently available, because as you said yourself, in a way, all of these, all the presently available technology is at some level not playing back, but is based on what it's observed about all of the data that's been put into it, right? So you might be able to create, in the current technology, I would expect to have technologies that are able to express love, ideas about love in very convincing ways. Write love sonnets, produce images that convey the love of one person for another, whether that be the love of friendship, Christian love, romantic love, all of these things, but they are not the emotion of love. What's going inside the computer is still mathematical things having to do with all of the data that's been fed into the computer.
Which reflects us.
Which reflects us, yes.
Yes. And
but
so
the computer is not loving.
yes. And okay, that's I think something that people will be thinking about and wondering about for years to come. Calvyn, is there anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, I was wondering about this idea of communication. Technology has always been involved in communication. Language, in some sense, is a technology we use. And so the question I would have is, there's always been a crisis when a new technology develops to communicate. And that started with Plato, way back. What do you think what is the biggest danger as individuals, people on this listening to us speak? What is one thing they have to watch out for when engaging with AI, and be aware of their own interaction with that to sense when something might become nefarious?
I think the biggest challenge, or the best thing that people can do in interacting with generative AI today is to be aware of the fact that whoever trained the AI has an objective, and that objective is not necessarily your good. They have some other objective. It could be political, it could be business, it could be some other form of influencing you that they benefit from, that's hard to foresee. So be aware of that. And if things look too surprising, too good to be true, too bad to be true, feel wrong, go against your conscience, then be aware of that and be willing to turn it off.
And on that insightful note, we now move to Calvyn. And Calvyn, can I ask you, what might be the linkage or crossover between spirituality and AI? And is there a scope for people of faith and non-faith to be creative in any such linkage or crossover? So perhaps getting to the nub of AI and faith.
Thank you. So I'm going to use like a little scheme to run through that question because as I mentioned, I'm very interested in spirituality and the many fields that is popped up in over the years. The past 50 years, it's been all over through nursing, where it normally denotes something like meaning. Why do nurses get up and do what they do? Sometimes in the corporate environment, it's used in terms of leadership. What kind of atmosphere does leadership inculcate in their company? And I think in that sense, it is a good fit for AI because AI is also so widely used and used in different areas. So what I will do is I have like what I call my 3 silly questions on spirituality. Silly not because they're frivolous, but mostly because they seem so easy to ask, but I don't see a lot of people asking them. And I'll run through them and I'll give it every time I'll give a normal like everyday example, and then I'll just commute that or like change that example to something more AI so it makes sense in the current context. So the 3 silly questions I have is firstly, why today especially do we think about spirituality mostly in qualitative terms and not in quantitative terms? Why is that? Second one would be, why do we think of spirituality only in terms of humanity, of humans? Why can't other things also have spirituality? And the third thing would be, why is spirituality always so positive? Like, it seems to me very strange. And this is a very modern thing. I'm going to argue that as I go through these points. So the first point is, and they hang together, by the way, so we'll see as it develops. So the first one is, why is spirituality always this quality, like this fuzzy quality, and not a quantitative phenomenon? So I would argue that in pre-modern times, it was more quantitative in some ways, because liturgy is a quantitative practice. You expose yourself constantly to a certain amount of practice, and that practice forms you in a way. That goes way back to the ancient Greeks already. And even earlier, I mean, to the ancient Jewish people. And I would argue we should investigate that, but through a modern lens. So we should say something like, why is it not the case that I have a kind of spiritual connection with a sweater that I have, like a sweater lying around? Some people have a favorite sweater. Why isn't that a special connection? That because you think about it, you wear it a lot, and it reiterates constantly. So in that sense, it is a kind of spiritual connection. Another example would be a disagreeable boss, maybe, that you think about, you fixate about, and it just doesn't, but it takes a lot of your mind space. It forms you in a way, which is spiritual, I would argue. And then I push it a little bit further into my second question. Why isn't the connection between, for example, plants and CO2, for example? Why isn't that a kind of spiritual connection? Because that's an iterative connection that's constantly happening and is symbiotic in some way. Now, and I would argue we should start thinking in that way, because then we can kind of like quantify what spirituality is. If people expose themselves to certain things constantly, that will inform them, that will form them as a spiritual being. And the same goes for AI. So I'm lowering the bar here on what spirituality is. I would claim that spirituality does have a kind of AI does have a kind of spirituality already, because of this iterative process. Now, this spirituality is not the same as human spirituality. And I'm trying to open the gates a little bit more for different kinds of spiritualities to happen. And those spiritualities are iterative, and they're creative, and they're formative. and they inform what the AI believes about itself in some ways, if you can use those words. And that's, once again, lowering the bar of what faith means, not the high bar, a lower bar. And in that sense, I would differ a little bit from what has been said before. And I would say, I think generative AI is genuinely creative and spiritual in some way. Technically creative, I would say. Wisdom is a different thing that we can talk about. So second thing, the second question that has to do with this question of quantity versus quality, and we could already see this in my description of the first question, is clearly non-human things can now be construed as having a kind of spirituality. And those spiritualities can have different qualities, and we can interact with them on the basis that they have some kind of like background information happening. Now, I can never assess if an AI or a generative AI has any spirituality. I cannot do it directly. I have to do it obliquely through a second thing, almost like seeing gravity. I can't see gravity directly. I have to assess the data and see that the gravity is there, see it in different places happening all the time. And then I can say, well, this is how gravity works. So if there is creativity in generative AI, we would be able to see that over and over and over again in different spaces. And the quality of that would be formed by the quantity of those every time having a generative experience, every time seeing creativity going from the AI. So that's the second question. The third question that I have is why is spirituality always so positive? And again, I would argue this is a very modern idea. I think if we start reading pre-modern texts, we get a lot of like demons and all of this very viscerally. People are aware of this. And it's part of their life world. We have become so modernized that we just think in positive terms constantly about spirituality, and we think about in human terms about it. So I would argue, like, spirituality can be negative as well. If spirituality is a meaning formative practice, then something like fundamentalism is definitely meaningful. It is a spirituality. And if we don't acknowledge that, we kind of lose the ability to be appreciative and to understand it, at least. We would just negate it and say, well, that's not spirituality, that's not important, let's just forget about that. Something like fascism as well, it's an extremely meaningful construct. And if we just pretend like it has nothing in it, it's just evil, we don't understand it. We don't try to think through why it's evil. That's the point. So I'll just run back through these questions again, or my 3 silly questions with AI in mind. And I think the question then to me is, how do we create a generative AI that doesn't show us the worst of ourselves constantly? And I would argue these 3 questions would help us, because spirituality is always this vacillation between aspiration and testing. Aspiration and testing. And if we build AI machines that is constantly testing their data against reality, then we will not have evil bots, if we could call them that. All of the examples I mentioned, fundamentalism, fascism, they don't test their theories against reality. They just have a theory in mind and they run with it. They don't they only see quality. They don't see quantity. They don't appreciate non-human objects. It's all just instrumental in their eyes. And so I think in that sense, as people of faith, as people that want to be creative with AI, the guardrail should be open up the AI to more good information that's in reality that it can access, so that it can be better acquainted with how the world works. and help us maybe to be better people than we have been feeding it data for. So.
Right, thank you. That's I think that that's very rich in saying that generative AI is exploring that. It means that we're also going to be exploring what the boundaries of spirituality, or pushing on the boundaries of spirituality as we push on the boundaries of AI. And that's going to be an iterative process of going back and forth, isn't it? Just as I think engineers and mathematicians and scientists are used to doing. Mm-hmm. So, okay, that's there's a lot to think there. Thank you very much, Calvyn. Kevin and Lee, is there anything you'd like to quickly say, speak into what Calvyn has said before we move on to perhaps one or two questions and then finish up?
Yeah, I mean, just to be very quick and be a sort of boring scientist, Calvyn, and that is that obviously in science, you know, we are obsessed is the wrong word. I think we're entrammelled in this idea that things are measurable, data is measurable, and of course we now hit very interesting thoughts indeed about the nature, the physiological nature of consciousness, for example. So there are, you know, people like Roger Penrose are looking at the structure of matter and how what he calls microtubules, how they might have a characteristic to which consciousness can be attributed. So, you know, that's just an example of how something which we might regard as a literally immeasurable essence, you know, spirituality, is something that we might want to quantify somehow. I mean, I agree. I mean, of course, the Catholic Church had it right, you know, many years ago, where you got charged a certain amount of money for a certain indulgence, and you know, if you paid this amount of money, you'd have so many prayers sent for you. So there was some quantification in the past.
And Lee,
stay away from some certain quantifications, I would argue.
Good point. Sorry, interrupted there. Go.
Sure. You mentioned wisdom a couple of times, and at least in the virtue ethics tradition, wisdom is something that can be learned. Do you see any prospects for that?
Absolutely. I mean, you think about like the origin of wisdom ethics in Aristotle, this idea of like constantly being exposed to a certain good set of values and then being formed by that. I think that it's an absolute possibility, as long, and there are, just like go back to Aristotle again, as long as the conditions are right. Like, and Aristotle is very dismissive at one stage about this. He says, well, if you're like in your 20s and you didn't have a good upbringing, then sorry, you're not going to be a good person, which I feel is a little bit mean. And I believe as a Christian that we can always change. That's the wonder about, you know, faith, is like we can always change. So I would just be careful. The modern virtue ethics always leaves that little part out. And I'm always wondering, when is this going to bite us? Because it's so popular. But I have some problems with it, and it comes from Aristotle's original conception of it. So,
right. Oh, look, thank you. We could talk about this for a long time. We could go all night or all day, depending on what part of the world you're viewing this from. I just wanted to put one question to the three of you from the chat. And the question is, can generative AI enhance a believer's awareness of divine revelation? And it goes on to say some revelation may not need enhancing because it hits the believer between the eyes, but less obvious revelation would benefit from being enhanced. Could generative AI help revelation hit the believer between the eyes?
Nobody wants to answer.
Never say never. Never say never.
Yeah.
I guess my thinking is where does the training data come from? So somehow that awareness of revelation needs to be, in a sense, innate in the training data. It need not be that there is already an essay or a sermon or a work of visual art or a poem or that encompasses it, but somehow there has to be enough related ideas that can be connected together through the correlations in the data to bring out that revelation. So not impossible, but it could be difficult.
And I think there is, I mean, in some ways, I mean, it is true that this is a training model situation, the generative AI situation, but in other ways, it's just the technology. So in technologies have always helped us have religious experiences. I mean, who hasn't read, some of us maybe have read a poem, and that has had a massive effect. Some people may chat to ChatGPT and they have a religious experience. It's not impossible that the amount of possible interactions to have a religious experience or clarify a religious experience is infinite. Science has, I mean, Kevin, science is this, you know, this sublime feeling. All of that is just part of a transcendental impulse, I would argue.
And Kevin?
Yeah, I actually declared my hand quite early on this one because I answered it in the put something down in the text. But I know I'm with Calvin on this one. I think absolutely. I think look, we as human beings, we go through life, and whether we are aware of it or not, we are undertaking what is known in the trade as the scientific method. You know, you see something, you get curious about it, you think about it, you try to explain it, you might even do an experiment, or you might make another observation, and depending upon the outcome of that observation or that experiment, that will either confirm, you know, endorse your model, it might change a little bit, or it might say that it's the wrong model, in which case you start again. But you go, this is how you go through life. This is how we as human beings learn to do things and learn about things. It's a sort of iterative, cyclical process. And you know, my view is that a lot of very deep questions, which sometimes we can't help thinking about, and which we are hoping will, with a bit of thinking, will lead to something hitting us between the eyes, that phrase that was used. So I've got a thing about the hitting between that's a eureka moment. You know, the point of impact, the moment of impact, you know, when it hits you between the eyes, that's a eureka moment. And I'm not sure those things exist as simply as we have hitherto thought. But any connections that can be made between, you know, existing ideas that we humans haven't made ourselves before, which obviously generative AI can do extremely well, could be helpful, could be extremely helpful. You know, learning and revelation can be a very individual thing. And if suddenly, thanks to AI, you see something which has made connections between, you know, different things that you hadn't seen before, and that somehow clarifies the picture that was previously very muddy and murky to you, then great. That's something which is helping you on your journey, as I'd say.
Right. Well, look, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but this is something that we could continue talking about and discussing, and I hope that people will go away and do that and use it as a jumping off point to interact with AI and to realize that AI is not divorced from faith, and that as people with faith in God, we have something to all say into AI, and it is also our responsibility to do that. So Lee, Kevin, Calvin, thank you very much for your time, and thank you to everybody for joining us. And I'm just going to hand over to Graham, who would like to finish up for us.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. But I hope you would say, I hope you would just lead us in prayer right at the end.
I
With
will.
that prayer, that would be grand. I just wanted to say a really big thank you to everybody, and particularly I'd like to say a big thank you to Lee for creating this. It's been really, really interesting. And that eureka moment, Kevin, I should never forget watching the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, you know, sitting down in the cinema, and suddenly this arrow, I was really struck by this arrow coming out of the cinema into it. And it was I think we have lots of those arrow moments, and this has been one of them. So thank you very, very much indeed. I mean, I'm going to take away a lot. I mean, watch this space. I think somebody said last time we need to do this more, and the you know, the cross pond conversations of which have been going on are really, really important. So thank you. I'd like to thank both Matt and Jeremy, our chairs, for stepping in. We appreciate you running it and asking those all important questions. And thank you to you for listening and being here. I mean, very few people have left, and what a treat it is to share this with people in London, other parts of the UK, and 2 time zones in the United States. Wow, that is something else. Like I said, watch this space. We'll do this again. Thank you very, very much. And Jeremy, would you like to lead us in a prayer, which I believe it was Matt said is an AI prayer?
Yes, this prayer that I'm going to pray through, Matt, for our first session, generated using the generative AI program called Llama 2. And I thought it'd be good to provide for continuity between the 2 sessions, and also just to sort of continue our exploration of how we can use AI in our own journey of faith. So I'm going to pray now, and if you agree with what this prayer says at the end, please join with me in saying Amen. Dear God, we come before you with open hearts and minds, seeking your guidance as we explore the impact of AI in our lives. We pray for wisdom and discernment as we navigate this rapidly changing world, and for the courage to use technology in a way that honors your will for us. May we always prioritize your values of love, compassion, and justice in our use of AI, and may we never lose sight of the dignity and humanity of all people. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody, and hope to see you again.